City of Norwood Planning Commission meeting for August 2nd. Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Mayor Schneider,
Present.
Chairman Powers,
Present.
Mrs. Sickinger, Mr. Hockney,
Present.
Mr. Sewer,
Present.
Move on to item B, approval of the minutes of June 7th, 2023. We have any changes to the minutes? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Chairman Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Hockney,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer,
Yes.
Moving on to our next item, new business. We have no new business. Do any of the members have any additional new business they would like to add to the agenda?
No, sir.
Hearing none, we'll move on to old business. Ordinance text amendment, to Part 11, for final comments by the Commission for public hearing to be set at September 6th, 2023 meeting of the Planning Commission, considering changes to planning and zoning code relating to various chapters to promote clarity and consistency in policy interpretation, processing minor PUD applications, dealing with fraternity or sorority houses, porous pavement, minor accessory equipment, structures, townhouses, electric vehicle charging stations, and other related changes. Each of us has the proposed ordinance included. It's a 9-page document. Mr. Skelly, if I could go through a couple of items with you, and then I'll turn it over to the other commissioners for discussion and questions. Sections 2, 3, and 4 on page 2. Those are struck, so those will be removed from the final ordinance as we stand here. Is that your intention?
Yeah, if I could just briefly mention, so on page 2, sections number 2 right through 10, part of the purpose for me having this on the agenda is kind of to seek your direction and also then to green light it for public hearing. But really, 2 to 10 come down to a direction from you guys as to, there was some staff discussion where we have, for example, agricultural uses, cemeteries, fraternity and sorority houses in the ordinance right now, for example, R3, where they're either permitted by right or sometimes conditional use. And there was some suggestions that maybe, since we do not have these uses in the city, and potentially nor do we want them, we could just remove them outright. So when we had the earlier draft for the zoning ordinance, sections 2 to 10 were written with that intention to strike them from the zoning ordinance. There has been some further discussion as per discussion with Dan Bly, that it's something, even with the law department, that it's worthwhile and maybe even necessary to just include them there, to have them listed somewhere in the ordinance. So my question to the Planning Commission meeting is that for those particular uses, as you see in 2 to 10, at least 5 to 7 months ago, there was a prevailing sentiment that these uses should just be removed. Subsequent to that, and with our discussion with Dan Bly on April the 18th, his sentiment was maybe just leave them. It's not really causing any issue. It's there. Whether we're fortunate not to have it, it's kind of beside the point. It's just that if we just keep it in the ordinance, we do have a place for these uses if established. So.
Thank you.
Can we comment on that?
Yes.
Mr. Skelly, I think you made a good point of saying it's whether we have it or do not have it at this time. And I think that we do not have some of these because of some of the verbiage that was put in here that made people aware that that's not a usage that's acceptable. So I think when the building commissioner is saying we should just leave it in there, do you think that's his intention, is that it sort of clarifies that the city's not
Yeah, in part, that could be his reasoning. So for example, cemeteries, in part, again, we're an urban municipality, acquiring the land would be rather expensive, and then as it's written right now in the ordinance, by making it a conditional use, that puts a further hurdle for a developer who wanted to do such things. So at the end of the day, that in itself would require a public hearing and have the property owner or developer make a justification for that. So I think, and again, there was back and forth discussion, but me personally, if it's something that's really not going to cause us any grief, you might as well just leave it. It's easy. And then essentially what you would see is, in terms of having a subsequent public hearing of this the next month, we would just remove 2 to 10 completely and keep it as is in the ordinance.
Okay.
So essentially, I guess the first question, if that's the case, then I can make it very easy for our public hearing by just leaving it, and then further cut any additional text from this amendment.
Question I have, no, if
Yes.
I could. If, look, we only have one university in this city, so if that university today, if we leave it in, wanted to create a fraternity or sorority house, what would be our response to that, the way it looks today, if we leave it just as it is?
As of right now, for example, in the R3 zone, which is essentially our highest density residential use, it's permitted by right, but there's about 4, essentially, spell out criteria that they would have to adhere to. So it's by right. If they adhere to this criteria, they can go ahead and do it.
Okay,
So that gives them the option.
all right. And the next question I have for you is on number 5. So you're inserting after hotels, correct?
Correct.
Is that to allow Airbnbs?
Actually, in part, that brings up a twofold point. So what the recommendation here in section 5 is transferring it from a permitted use to a conditional use. And then to answer your second question, again, there has been some discussion, and Carrie is probably the best person to deal with it because she handles these calls probably on a weekly basis, is that we could also insert short-term rentals as part of this mix and treat them similar to as a hotel or motel. And then they could also be subject to a conditional use hearing. So I think right now, we do not have that particular use defined. I believe the building department treats it as a hotel, potentially, or lodging.
As recommended by the law department, we're looking at it as under the same as hotel motel, that definition, because it's still short-term rental. So the law department said that's where we should look at it. It's not a conditional use at this point. If they're in an R3 zoning district, then we're taking it in as a change of use from a typical rental, and Dan's looking at it. They're showing him the floor plans, how the floor plans are used, that they have smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, you know, that they're not going through a hallway from to the only bathroom kind of thing. And then we're saying, okay. But I have had people question me that it's not specifically called out. How can we do that? And
I defer that to the law department, right? I mean,
well, yeah, I did. But what this is saying is that they would now become a conditional use? So they
Well-
would go before Board of Zoning Appeals in the R3 zoning district?
In the current section 5, that was the intent. But if we leave everything as is, then hotels, boarding, lodging houses would remain as a permitted use in the R3, for example.
Mike, if we could look at page 6, which is the proposed 1151.12 residential design standards. You and I had discussed earlier making a fairly simple alteration to this and making a reference to the table 1 in 115141, which basically gives the setbacks for the different types of properties. And that would provide a little bit of clarity in this area in terms of how far a townhome or row home would have to be set back from the sides and from the street.
Correct. So, do you want me to provide a bit of background for that?
Please.
Okay. So, I would say more major or substantive part of this particular zoning ordinance, in addition to forest paving, is coming up with new standards for townhomes or row homes. And like I said, for quite some time we've been debating that. In the earlier versions, we came up with pretty substantive design standards, setbacks, all those things. Subsequent to meeting with Dan Bly, there was a statement, it could have been perceived as overkill. It's a lot of very definitive design measures that we were suggesting. So he provided some guidance as to simplifying it while still adhering to the intent. So one of the elements, and we were talking about the actual chart that we have, so we would be introducing, particularly as part of the R3, a specific design provision for row homes or townhomes. But in addition to that, now we would provide a descriptor that a person developing this sort of thing would have to go through some sort of criteria as to what they're incorporating. So on page 6, item C, there's about 8 elements that you would see. And essentially, for the most part, what you see on page 6 of 9 for the current document is a change from having that more substantive, detailed, dictating, okay, how these type of developments should be designed, including like the offset or the staggering of the units. So, the answer?
Yes.
Okay. So again, I think we talked about it. I think this is a good compromise. It will be definitely viewed as maybe a benefit from what we currently have, but not as exhaustive as what we saw before.
Mike, on page 7, section 26, you have introduced a definition for electric vehicle recharging station at section 1111.54B, and that's particularly maintain the alphabetical order of our definitions in this section. But I would suggest that we probably want to do a little more robust reordering of that, the subsequent sections to this.
Okay.
To avoid having that be. So that would be something the law department can take a look at and give us some advice on how to do that. There's a couple of reserved sections, so we do have a little bit of room to move things around and keep that order without having to go down to that.
Okay.
Does, when you're in this one for the electric vehicle recharging, does it address vehicles parked on public right-of-way with a cord ran across to charging them?
I believe it would in terms of, for practical purposes, partly because, again, it's a zoning ordinance, it primarily focuses on private property. I think in addition to that, we would have hopefully ample provisions in our traffic code restricting, non-municipal sort of equipment or facilities going across our right-of-way. To me, that would almost be, both explanation. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but once a trespass or a potential hazard is part of the public right of way.
I'll add to that and say that we have had some issues with folks doing that now. We've been able to resolve that as our code stands. Based on the way that Mike described it, it's an interference in the public right of way.
Okay.
Any additional questions or comments? Mike?
Well, when the commission's done through their review and discussion, I do have one at the end I'd like to request.
Well, can we talk about porous pavement? Because I feel like it all started when we started working on this porous pavement stuff, and the recommendation and request from different residents for porous pavement. And Carrie, I'll direct a question to you because I know that you've been involved in these discussions with different people. I know the Baines were 3 or 4 years ago, Al and Marlene Bain were interested in this type of stuff. This change allows manufactured paving systems that allow stormwater to be channeled and percolated to the ground, which we have a lot of stormwater problems, and with all the flooding issues and different things. I think this meets some of the requests that have been made for the city through the years. Have you read this part of it, Carrie, and you feel
Yes.
comfortable with it?
This part, where was my notes? I actually made notes on things. Yes, I was comfortable with this. It specifically calls out not using gravel, which is part of it. It talks about the property owner being responsible for maintaining that drainage and not letting it get fouled or clogged up to where it doesn't drain. I do not know who would be the one monitoring that. That's always how do we determine that this is clogged up, other than driving by when it's raining and seeing it not, I can't imagine that any of these can handle some of the rains that we've been getting, but I don't know that we have anybody educated in it, I guess, is what I'm saying, to say this is right, that's not. But as far as what it says, I liked it. I did not have any notes on it.
Okay. And then the other question, if I might, we talked about townhouses, and we've had significant discussion on that. We've had some speculation on what can happen with townhouses or will happen with townhouses in the future. Mr. Skelly, can you talk a little bit about that part of it?
Sure.
What's in here?
So right now, and I would guide your attention to page 5, section 24 and section 25. So there's current provisions in our ordinance that treat row homes or townhouses as one building block, and essentially a developer could essentially just plop it down while still meeting what we saw when we talked earlier about the chart in terms of having the setbacks. So with the recommendations or suggestions you read as part of 5 and 6, what we're doing now is pushing the meter a bit towards treating them that they will have a little bit more elaborate design, better design treatment. So that's why on page 5, section 24 and 25, I'm deleting those provisions as it applies to them right now, and then inserting the provisions, the revised provisions that you see on page 6. So it comes down to providing, where we would like them in terms of public street. We don't want to have them fronting on the courtyard. And as you work your way down through the provisions, I guess the main one is essentially C, which replaces, I would say, a laundry list of a dozen items that we had in the previous ordinance. where they were very specific, including requiring or demanding, okay, for each townhouse unit, you had to have also a amenity area and a green space. So that goes back to the discussions we had with Dan Bly saying, hey, that might be overkill, a little bit too much. We're trying to encourage these things, but not maybe dissuading developers saying, hey, that's a bit much, I can't make this project work. Granted, in that case, the developer could always ask for a variance or something because if they could show a hardship, but the belief is that it would just make it easier for all parties' sake to simplify it. And that's why what you see now is the revised page 6.
All right,
So-
thank you.
So,
And Dan would be the judgment on those items. It says at least 4, because I thought it was interesting to see those, 8 items, and Dan would be the one, because they're kind of subjective.
Correct, and that was part of the debate that we had before, because there were sometimes a bit of substance, but I'd say essentially the more words, the more descriptors, it's more definitive. And sometimes people like that, lawyers, et cetera, because it gives that very specific marching orders. In this case, we provide almost like a la carte. You would go down saying, here are the things we would like to see. We have seen, and we could get examples where a developer could still build a townhouse or a row house block, and through creative designs, details, roof lines, window placement, a little porch or whatever, they can still have a building block, but do enough that you would look at it and say, oh, it's somewhat unique and different.
Now, I think the big one there that I see is the issue about the parking lots and the frontage of the buildings will be on the street, putting the parking in the back. That's your item A.
Yeah, and again, I can't say I have seen townhouses that do have sometimes parking in the front, and it's not necessarily bad, but some people refer to that almost like as a dog snout townhouse because you have that impacting. But again, from a practical purpose, some people want to park their car in the front and then walk through. But if you're talking about a potential lot that's only 25 feet wide, you can kind of perceive of that sort of, breaking up the streetscape.
And Dan is, you guys have had meetings with Dan on these, right?
We had a conference call, correct?
Okay, so I think he said no, that you've gone through them. That's fine.
No, that's not to say that Dan is in agreement with everything.
Oh, I get that, but he's at least seen these.
Yes,
Because now he will be the one
correct.
responsible to stop something from moving forward because it doesn't meet
Yes, that's
at
right.
least 4 of those criteria.
Mrs. Town?
thank you, sir. So when you take out, on section 24, and you take out 1151.10, which is yard requirements for multifamily dwelling units, it's not, that definition is not specific to residential. Your residential zoning districts, you're taking it out for any multifamily and replacing it with a section specific for residential. We do have design standards in 1151.30 for commercial zones, but this is kind of a guideline for those zones also.
Mike, I believe that's contained in the table at 1151.41.
Yeah, just to be clear, your question, can you rephrase it or?
When you take out 1151.10, that covers yard requirements for multifamily units anywhere in the city. Is it covered someplace else in the code that, so that somebody doesn't say, well, you don't have any yard requirements for a 10-unit building in an office zoning district?
So for the multifamily as it states right now, there really isn't anything. So what is being proposed for the new one in page 5, you will have that revision to the chart. You see?
So they're not going to have one front yard, one backyard, one side yard.
They would still have to adhere to, let's say if they're going in R3, they would still have to adhere to the
Okay.
front setback of 20 and all that.
Okay.
But it's more, like I said, it comes down to the more detailed things. So it's to me, it's a bit of a confusing thing. It's, you know, the fear is that you could have almost the perception that none of these would apply.
None of these what?
None of these things as written right now could apply. So that's more of an interpretation or legal concern I had, so.
So the yard requirements are still in the chart on section 22.
Yeah, I would say at least, you know, Dan By would likely go with this, versus maybe just looking at that and saying, oh, it's a multifamily, okay, well, fine, don't worry about it. That's, you know, ultimately it would be his discretion, so.
Any additional discussion, questions, comments?
In this matrix you have, it's a maximum building height of 35 feet, which is R3, and then that's the same goes for the row house,
Yeah.
or townhouse.
Correct.
What is that 35 feet based upon?
It's typically from the average grade of the building to if you had a pitched roof to the midpoint.
Okay, and where does the 35 feet, that 35 number come from?
That's existing as of right now for the current, actually for all the residential. So for R1, R2, R3, and the RMX zone, the maximum building height is 35 feet right now.
R1, R2, and R3.
Yeah, and RMX. And then the next category moving up would be office, which then you start moving up to 50 feet.
Okay. And these townhouses on the same matrix, you're saying they have to be 2,500 square feet per dwelling unit?
Correct,
For the lot size.
for the lot size. So under
Lot size.
the column has its minimum lot area in parentheses square feet, similar to the R3. So for each dwelling unit that you would have, again, like an apartment building, condominium, you need a representative increase in that lot area to accommodate each number of dwelling units. So if you were, like for example, in the current R3, if you were going to have a triplex, you would require 4,500 square feet for that lot.
So for these, I'm sorry, no, can I continue on some questions? I mean,
Yes.
it says minimum front setback for an R3 is 20 feet, but then for a row home or a townhouse, it's 15 feet. And that goes back to your dog snout
Yep.
townhouse. And now we're saying 15 feet, which includes a sidewalk out in front and you'd be able to park in front of these townhouses, correct?
Yeah, and I would kind of use whether you drive like a Prius versus a Suburban. So to me, the typical car you would probably see now, excluding kind of the micro cars, is typically around 14, 15 feet in length. If you would use representative, what we have as our dimensions for a typical parking stall, that's 19 feet. So a lot of municipalities, planners, designers use 20 feet as a guidepost because it's typically the length of a car. So my suggestion is to use something less, which is closer to kind of like an urban feel. Like in certain places, we encourage that buildings be right next to the right-of-way or sidewalk with a minimal amount of setback. So following that philosophy, I put 15 feet with the intent that you could still accommodate a smaller car in front, and then if you would have other design features, you'll have that additional green space available.
So does that setback start at the sidewalk, the interior side of the sidewalk?
Almost, but typically, once you have the sidewalk in place, most right-of-ways will start 6 inches, 12 inches back from the sidewalk. So wherever is the right-of-way, which is the dividing line between private and public property, that's where the setback starts. So as a rule of thumb, the sidewalk plus 6 or 12 inches is roughly where you would be.
I'm not sure that applies to floral, though.
You're
That
not
rule
sure of what?
That rule of thumb, because floral has that big
Well, yeah,
space.
I'm not thinking of floral, I'm thinking if you did townhouses and you did the dog snout design, where you put the garages in front, and then somebody parked there, their car, the back end of their car could be hanging over the sidewalk that's there at 15 feet. It doesn't seem like that would accommodate. And clearly, you're going to have people that use that front driveway and they park a car there every day because they fill their garage up with storage stuff, and they park there, and now you have a car block. I'm thinking that 15 is a small amount. That's why I bring it up.
Correct. The only thing I would say is that, and we talked earlier, so on page 6, when you had B, the intent is we encourage either through alleys or whatever, that off-street parking would be from the rear, and if you wanted to have it in the front, you would go through the BZA and provide for better justification. So if you were going to waver from that intent, then at least the mechanism would be fine, go through the BZA. So, but,
So if you wanted to build townhomes with a 15-foot setback and parking in the front, you would have to go to BZA in order to do that.
correct, and I think it goes back to, you know, post-dam blight discussion, we're trying to have that fine balance where, in terms of trying to not avoid a complete prohibition, but allow for their intent, that our preference is that you would have a nice streetscape with porches, et cetera, and do all the parking from the rear. But if you were truly intent, or you could provide justification, I don't know, I'm thinking, okay, the rear yard has too much of a grade differential, has other issues, there could be a stormwater swale, and they have to have it out front, that's a valid argument, but you have to go through the BZA to justify that, to get the relief.
This table, as I look at it though, Mike, minimum or maximum building height is 35 feet, and for row houses, it's 35 feet. No minimum building height, then the minimum lot area, I can see why that would be defined and changed. Minimum front setback is 20 feet, and then on the townhouses, we dropped it down to 15, which I'm not sure why we wouldn't just keep it at 20. And the minimum side setback, I understand you've got row houses with common walls, but then your minimum rear setback goes from 20 feet to 30 feet.
Correct.
What's the justification for taking that from 20 to 30 feet?
Part of it was, to me, trying to make a last-ditch effort to at least try to ensure some sort of minimum green space to the rear. So if that meant having a townhouse unit that maybe is not as large, providing some sort of, I don't want to say gold plating, but providing a decent amount of rear landscape area or something else that you provide that. My fear is that if someone wanted to say, well, fine, it has 20 feet, and someone was going to provide very large townhouses, you would have potentially a canyon effect on the rear, where through whatever reason, everything's very close. And you have 20 feet, you know, there's 40 feet separation between the backyards. So, versus, you know, maybe potentially 60 feet. So that was the intent, but by all means, if you want to keep it consistent across the board, then we would just replicate those two performance setbacks to be identical to the standard R3.
Well, I commend you for thinking of the green space and putting some sort of buffer in there and those things, but if I was a developer, we have any developers in the crowd? No, we don't have any developers in the crowd. But if I was a developer, I'd say, well, you're taking away from my project, you know, by, it's just 10 feet from the 20, but I'd say you're taking away from the potential there. So unless other commissioners have concern or thought on that.
The only thing I would add is that the building department considers this chart in the zoning part of it as required setbacks. So you don't build in those required, you have a percentage you can build in that. So to know if you're talking about wanting to give them something for sheds or stuff like that, that might run into, you know, you're supposed to have a required rear yard.
And I think we should be consistent.
So for the setbacks, moving from minimum front setback to minimum side setbacks, minimum rear setbacks, and maximum front setbacks, we would be consistent in the R3 zone.
I think that is correct. That's what I would recommend.
Yeah. The only thing I would just, not to be argumentative, but for the minimum side yard, when you have a row house or a townhouse, is essentially for an interior unit, there's no setback. The reason sometimes you may want to have a wider or more space is at the end unit. Essentially, there's usually a bit more because sometimes for fire safety or whatever, you provide that additional space for people getting through. If you would have the end unit of one lot and the end unit of another, and if there was a distance between the two buildings of 12 feet, my only concern being, is that sufficient space for any sort of fire emergency or other need? Because you're talking about the potential for a succession of townhouse buildings being, let's say, 6 or 8. So that's hence why I provided a bit more separation at the end unit, only for the end unit, obviously. So,
I can understand that because you'd have potentially utilities coming in from that end, or even the electric meters, the boxes would be on that end, or you would have your condensers. Potentially you have condensers on either end, so I could see where maybe that 8 feet makes a difference in those areas.
yeah, and I'll give you an example. So I have a townhouse. Occasionally I have to trespass onto other people's property to do things, or another related example, people are unlikely to take their grass mower through the house to cut their back sometimes, as opposed to just going around sometimes. So whether you have an easement or a wider area, I think that's sometimes the reason that you would provide a little bit more space in addition to fire access. So.
Okay, so we will, section 22, change the minimum front setback, minimum rear setbacks to 20 feet, maintain the minimum side setback at 8 feet.
Thank you.
For the row home or townhouse.
And the maximum front yard at 25?
I believe we would,
Which keeps
Keep-
them from building farther back and leaving larger driveways, I guess.
commissioners have thoughts on that? Do we want to keep that at 25, or do we want to make that consistent with the rest of the R3 district?
Which means not even define it?
Yes.
I would rather leave it where it's at, defined at 25.
Okay, we will do that, unless there's an objection.
Any of these, as Dan Bly is reviewing them, can go to the Board of Zoning Appeals for a variance.
Absolutely.
Correct.
So it's not, they're going to leave over 2 feet. So I think that's how I feel these would be guidelines, and you move forward from there. So I think they all seem reasonable.
Okay. Any
No,
additional?
I hate to beat a dead horse. I really wanted to be able to leave understanding where we as a planning commission stand on, and I'll use the term Airbnbs and not hotels. But that section to me reads like it allows, the way it's written, boarding for up to 4 people in one place. And again, I'm just, and then Carrie said something that's interesting. I didn't bring my book with me.
There's a book.
That it's in R3s only.
The R3 zone is the first place you see hotel, motel, boarding houses allowed.
As a
It's-
conditional, as a use?
As
believe
a
it's
use.
permitted use.
As
A
a
permitted
permitted
use?
use.
Okay,
They're
I'm
not
sorry, I didn't
mentioned- They're not mentioned in any of the other residential zoning districts.
So technically then,
They could also be
that
an
takes care of my
office.
issue, that it is not a conditional use in R1s and R2s. I mean,
Correct.
that's my concern. I know enough about Airbnbs that they are really used extensively for bachelor parties, fraternity, whatever, in residential areas, and I really personally do not want one next to me. And if I don't, and I'm pretty open-minded, I would think there'd be a lot of people that don't want them in a residential, R1 and R2.
RMX, R1, R2, RMX.
Okay.
Do not have, you see it first at the R3, and then it's in some of the other business districts that allows it also.
Mike, I'm sorry, does that
No,
make
no, no,
sense?
and here's at least maybe a compromise suggestion. So short-term rentals are definitely a controversial topic. Some municipalities spend considerable time and considerable policies on that. The way I look at it here for Norwood, so we do have, I guess, the legal solution that was offered to provide, okay, we'll consider these things as a lodging, and then it's permitted by right. But we don't have the reciprocal policies, and I'm going to use the example as a bed and breakfast. So we have fairly detailed bed and breakfast policies. To me, a short-term rental is kind of like that animal, so they should maybe be treated the same, which is again also a conditional use with these standards. So it just depends how extensive the planning commission would like to get about that. I can absolutely tell you, some municipalities do spend considerable time, because as you said, there's a lot of issues with bad operators, how these things are done, and it could be problematic sometimes to a stable neighborhood, and sometimes the biggest concern is parking, because if you have a unit that, and to me, when we talked about only having 4 unrelated people, bear in mind that that's irrelevant to a hotel, because you could squeeze in 6 people. It's similar to a hotel. So if it's a bachelor party or whatever, and they all decide to crash there, the 4 occupants or non-family members, that doesn't apply to a short-term rental. So they could squeeze in more people.
And I think you've answered my question, that it probably deserves longer review, longer discussion, and I think it's coming.
Yeah.
I think we're, and again, I think it's great that we got charging state. I think this is a much bigger issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think Airbnbs are coming, and they're going to come to Norwood, and they're going to come to the residential areas of R1 and R2 and RX. And,
They are already here.
and right now, I know it's great that the law department has said that, but there's no enforcement. And I think we know where they're at.
Yeah. So anyways, all I could offer is and Carrie and I did talk to about it yesterday, I believe.
Mine was very simple,
Yeah.
but I did have a citizen last week come in handing me the bed and breakfast and saying, do Airbnbs short-term rentals, which I refer to them as short-term rentals because Airbnb has sort of become more of a brand
Sure.
almost.
I get
But
that.
he was, I have this going in next to me, it doesn't meet the bed and breakfast standards. And I said, it's not a bed and breakfast. So there is some concern out there with neighbors and citizens who didn't move into this. They didn't move into a place that had these kinds of units. And he wanted to make sure that he was okay if it was going to be there as long as it met these standards. And I just,
Yeah. So what I would offer is I can have, we can finish up this ordinance and then following at the heels, letting this application go through, I can promise, because it's not going to take that much time for me to do it, talk to staff, and you guys even provide right now for the subcommittee meeting, what are your do's and don'ts and what are your preferences, and we could get that done fairly quickly.
But I just think it should be a topic, and it can follow this, I think, without any trouble. But I think we ought to put it on our plate as something we really should address. What do we want it to be? And that's, right now, it just feels like you have the law department who has said it's this. But there's nothing in here that,
Well, I think the law department was just providing for a quick interpretation if you had to make a determination on the spot. But like we're doing right now, to me, a zoning ordinance is a dynamic document. It could change, year to year as issues arise. So if short-term rentals is something that people are experiencing more as a detriment to their neighborhood, by all means, we can add that as a policy.
anyway, no, I just thought I'd bring it up because I would not delay this over this. I mean, I think we keep this moving. But I think we do put it on the plate to maybe, like, spending some time and coming back saying, what are some of the modifications that we should make?
Yeah, we can do that.
I know we have a municipality across the river that I know is attacking this head on in Covington.
All right, for our next meeting, Mike, if you'll make some suggestions on ways we can look at that issue, we'll have a fuller discussion on that. Any additional changes to the zoning ordinance amendment? Questions, Mike?
Once the committee's on, did you have one quick request favor? So I'll bring that up when it's appropriate.
Anything from the commission? Mike, please continue.
Good. Okay. Just to give you some quick background. So when last year the first consolidated zoning ordinance we passed, one of the big things we had was kind of simplifying the land use chart. And, we saw essentially we were taking the various zones and we were kind of replicating the uses like we're talking in the R3, and we were creating different uses. So as part of that exercise, I was respecting the ordinance and bringing things in verbatim, exactly as it was listed, not providing for any major changes. I had a landowner recently bring up a concern to him in the sense that if you would look at the R3, the current R3 permits, and we were talking about extensively now, multifamily residences. Multifamily residences are defined as 3 or more dwelling units. And in that gentleman's concern, he was going to be providing for, I believe, like 4 or 5. And when he went through the chart, as it's right now in our revised ordinance with the improved consolidated chart, he pointed to the fact that it says here, and I'll distribute copies, that 4 or 5 would not be permitted. And the reason it looks like that is because when I imported as part of the chart that existing definition that you would read in the office or the neighborhood commercial zone, that's how it's specified. So it was almost like a understanding, well, obviously if you have 3 or more, it's permitted. So his concern was, again, that technically you could interpret that should be included as well. So what I am distributing right now is what the ordinance shows as the current condition and what the easy fix would be. So my request to the Planning Commission is that when I'm going to revise the ordinance, which we talked about, and have it circulated for the public hearing, I would like to ensure that under the R3 zone, that 5 or more family dwellings and 4 are understood as permitted, because obviously if it's a multifamily, 3 or more, by right then that extends to 4 or 5. So it might seem very basic, but it's, because it's written in the zoning ordinance as a legal matter, I wanted to just pass it on to you, so you're aware of it.
I would classify that as a scrivener's error, so correcting a typo. I don't see any issue with that. Any issues from the other commissioners?
No, sir.
Mike, if you'll add that change in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And at least from my end, so that is it in terms of providing for the overview of the ordinance as you see in your package. And by all means, if there's additional discussion you guys have after this meeting, you know, please email me or whatever. Call me.
Okay. Any additional old business? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to excuse our absent member.
I'll make the motion to excuse the absent member.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Mrs. Talmadge, please call the roll.
Chairman Powers,
Yes?
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Mr. Hockney,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer,
Yes.
Only item that remains is adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Before you do that, if I could ask, so the next step with this, that we just went through the ordinance, is Mike will clean this up, attach it, and it'll go out into the,
September meeting for Planning Commission, and that'll be a public hearing where it'll get notified in the newspaper. That's all.
And at that point, we will vote whether to send it to council.
after we listen to the public hearing, to the residents, we'll then discuss it ourselves and decide if we want to continue the movement to council.
Correct.
It's the first time we've really,
Or change it again.
Yes.
or modify it based on the comments. I apologize, I'm just trying to make sure.
Yes, you understand it correctly.
Okay, thank you.
Well, anything further? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Mrs. Talmadge, please call the roll.
Chairman Powers,
Yes.
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Mr. Hockney,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes.
We are adjourned at 4:22 p.m. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.